Welcome to Chapter 17.3, The Birth of the American Republic. In the mid-1700s, Britain was a formidable global power. Key reasons for this status included the location, the support of commerce, and the huge gains in territory around the world. Furthermore, the new King George III, began to assert his leadership and royal power. Britain's growing empire included prosperous colonies on the east coast of North America, and these colonists shared many common values. These values included an increasing sense of their own destiny separate from Britain. In some cases, Britain neglected to enforce laws dealing with the colonial trade and manufacturing. Tensions between the colonists and the British grew as Parliament passed laws, such as the Stamp Act, that increased colonist taxation. The colonists protested that they saw these taxes as taxation without representation, and a series of violent clashes with the British soldiers intensified colonists' anger. Finally, representatives from each colony, including George Washington from Virginia, met in a Continental Congress to decide what to do. Then, in April 1775, colonists fought British soldiers at Lexington and Concord, and the American Revolution began. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. This was written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, and it reflected John Locke's ideas about the rights to life, liberty, and property. It also detailed the colonists' grievances and emphasized the Enlightenment idea of popular sovereignty. At first, the chances of American success looked bleak. The colonists struggled against the British trained soldiers, and the British had a huge navy and had much greater resources. But when the colonists won the Battle of Saratoga, other European nations, such as France, joined the American side. With the help of the French fleet, Washington forced the British to surrender at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. 2 years later, American, British, and French diplomats signed the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war. In 1789, the leaders of the new United States, such as James Madison and Benjamin Franklin, had established a federal republic under the Constitution, and the new government was based on the separation of powers, an idea borrowed directly from Montesquieu. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, protected the basic rights of men, and the United States Constitution put Enlightenment ideas into practice and has become an important symbol of freedom. By the 1700s, Britain was a global power. The sun never set on the British Empire, as some were known to say. And it had a great ability to trade due to its location and the colonies, and it imposed fewer restrictions on trade than any other nation at that time. It had won previous European conflicts, and so had acquired more colonies. And it held a monopoly on the slave trade in Spanish America. England also took control of Ireland in the 1600s, and it joined with Scotland and Wales in 1707 to create what is called the United Kingdom, or Great Britain. George III began a 60-year reign as King of England in 1760. And although there was the Enlightenment going on, George's goals for his reign was to reassert his royal power. He wanted to, number one, end the Whig domination, and number two, to choose his own ministers, number three, to dissolve the cabinet system, number four, to make Parliament follow his will. On the continent of North America, a string of prosperous British colonies stretched across the eastern coast of North America. Colonial cities linked North America to the West Indies, Africa, and even Europe, and the colonies were the home of a diverse group of religious and ethnic peoples. Social distinctions were much more blurred in North America than they were in Europe. People were much more on equal terms. And also, political discussion was much freer in North America than in other parts of the world. The wars in Europe and in the Americas had drained the British treasury, and King George III was expecting the colonists to help pay for all these wars. Part of the reason why these wars were fought in North America was to help protect the colonists from French incursions. In 1774, for example, the Sugar Act was created to help pay for the war by importing taxes, by putting tariffs on imports. The Stamp Act of 1765 imposed taxes on newspapers and pamphlets or anything that was on paper. It was eventually repealed in 1776 due to a huge uprising by the colonists. Again in 1776, at the end of the year, there was the Declaratory Act, which basically just proclaimed that Britain had the right to put taxes on colonists. But because of the colonists had no voice in Parliament, they argued that they were subject to taxation without representation. This caused a lot of conflict, and violent clashes started to break out in the colonies. One violent clash was in 1770 when the British troops opened fire on a mob in Boston that was threatening them. Another one was in 1773 when a group of colonists dressed up as Indians and perpetrated the Boston Tea Party. Parliament passed harsh laws to punish Massachusetts for the destruction of that tea, and the colonists rallied to support Massachusetts. So representatives from each colony gathered in Philadelphia and met in a Continental Congress to decide what actions should be taken. After a lot of debate, American colonists declared their independence. In April of 1775, war between the colonists and the British broke out. Congress formed the Continental Army, with George Washington as their leader. And in July of 1776, the Continental Congress declared independence from Britain. The Declaration of Independence was inspired by the ideas of John Locke and principally written by Thomas Jefferson. The government had an obligation to protect the people's natural rights. People had the right to alter or abolish unjust governments, and clearly stated the principles of popular sovereignty in the Declaration of Independence, that all government powers should come from the people, not from God. So, this is a very famous quote from the Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." At the beginning of the war, the Americans were severely disadvantaged. The British had a huge navy. They had large numbers of trained soldiers, and they had astronomical resources at their disposal. The Americans, on the other hand, had very few militia, which are basically unpaid private citizens who work together in a military force. And they had very little money to pay any soldiers, and they had no plan, no strategy. George Washington and his army used the few advantages that they did have. They were on their home turf, they had strong leadership, and they had a lot of determination to fight for their liberty. But most importantly, the Americans needed an alliance or foreign support to help supply and train their soldiers and help them with supplying them. So after the American victory in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, France was persuaded to join the Americans against the British. And once France joined the American side, Spain and the Netherlands also decided to join as well. In 1781, the French fleet blockaded the Chesapeake Bay and created a decisive victory for the Americans at the Battle of Virginia in Yorktown. The war was ended in 1783, and a treaty was signed in Paris, known creatively as the Treaty of Paris. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. The first Constitution of the United States was known as the Articles of Confederation. This ultimately proved too weak to rule the diverse states that were part of this new United States of America. And it also, because of the weaknesses that were eventually became very, very obvious, it led to the creation of the second Constitution, which was created by the Constitutional Convention in 1787. George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and others gathered to redraft the Articles of Confederation into a new Constitution. The Constitution of the United States created a federal republic with powers divided between the national governments and the state governments. The government was the social contract with a system of checks and balances. The president and the legislature were both elected offices, and there would be a separation of power among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution were also known as the Bill of Rights. They stated that the citizens had basic rights that the government was required to protect, and among these would be freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to bear arms, the right to a due process of law. This new Constitution was adopted in 1789, and it became a symbol of freedom to European and Latin American reformers. The leaders of the American Revolution were inspired by the ideas spread during the Enlightenment, and the success of the American Revolution influenced the revolutions to come in France in 1789 and in Latin America and in much of the other European countries in the 1800s.